Welcome back to the show, my friends, my wordsmiths. I'm so excited for today's episode. We've got an excellent guest, one that I know somewhat personally as a former professor and also just an amazing creative writer in general. We've got Josh Allen on. He is a author of children's horror, and I have to say is one of my favorites. If you grew up reading Goosebumps or anything along those lines, scary stories to tell in the dark, it's like the new, the new version. Out to Get You is the first book. Something special about the cover. Maybe Josh might want to talk about that, but I'm going to let him introduce himself. So, Josh, welcome to the show.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you here. Do you want to give us just a little background about your life in writing and what you're doing today?
Sure. I'm Josh Allen, and I'm the author of two books. My first book is titled Out to Get You, 13 Tales of Weirdness and Woe. It came out in 2019, and my second book is titled Only If You Dare, 13 Stories of Darkness and Doom, and it came out last August. I write stories for, like Sheridan said, I write horror stories for children. My target age group, my audience target is about 12 years of age. I'm aiming for like fifth grade, sixth grade, sometimes fourth graders, sometimes as old as seventh or eighth grade, but usually that sweet spot I aim for is about fifth or sixth grade. I write stories about things like haunted microwaves, the possessed paper towel dispenser in the boys' bathroom, the world's grossest bowl of oatmeal. But then there are some traditional kind of horror tropes that I play with as well. Scary clowns, vampire, sort of my own version of vampires and things like that. And the covers of my books, which were both designed by the brilliant Sarah J. Coleman, they glow in the dark. I think that's what you were alluding to, Sheridan. Yes,
That's
these were
exactly what I was alluding
glow in the
to. Yeah.
dark covers for these books. And each story is also illustrated by Sarah in just a creepy, fantastic, spooky way. Sarah's work is just awesome. I am a professor at Brigham Young University, Idaho. I teach composition and creative writing, and I've been here for 18 years. I have a Master's of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from Old Dominion University.
So he's as experienced, if not more, in reading the creative as he is in writing the creative. That could be vouched for with the stacks of papers that he's currently
Currently
probably wrapping
grading
up
my
with the
way through.
semester. So as always, I've got my hair up, I've got my pen in, got my notebook here. I'm ready to take notes. I would invite anyone who's listening to take notes as well. We can learn a lot from Josh today, with his unique insights into writing. But one thing I wanted to touch on is that so Josh has written, um, if I remember correctly, for other genres and other audiences, right? I think you have a publication, an adult publication
Yeah, I
on
have a
ages.
handful of short stories, an essay, work of nonfiction published. I've never published a poem, but I've published short stories for adults and some creative nonfiction for adults as well.
You act like that's not a feat.
But it's
Poems
not
are hard to
much.
publish,
It's
but so
really,
are short stories.
yeah, it's I
Uh,
haven't published much for adults, but I've published a handful of things. Yeah.
yeah. So with your experience in such different and broad genres, can you talk a little about, I mean, what made you decide that children's books were the genre for you? And was there any kind of stigma there that if you're not writing something serious for adults, then you're not really a real writer?
Yeah, so I'm a first generation college graduate, and I fell in love with stories and reading at a really early age, especially horror. I fell in love with the Twilight Zone. My dad and I used to watch the Twilight Zone together when I was a kid.
So
And
good.
yeah, so good. And I think the first horror book I remember just completely going nuts for was Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. And I just fell in love with stories. And as a first generation college student, as a first generation college graduate, when I went to college, I noticed that my professors, like, there was a certain kind of story that the academic world valued. And it's not the kind of story that you can find in books that glow in the dark, quite frankly. It's kind of a contemporary literary fiction for adults. And I wanted to be a good college student, right? I wanted to be a good writer. And I had so many voices around me in my undergraduate work and my graduate work saying that if you want to be a serious good writer, you need to write contemporary literary fiction for adults. That's kind of where it's at. And I love contemporary literary fiction for adults. I can quote the last page of The Great Gatsby from memory. I'm a huge fan of, I've taught an entire class on Ernest Hemingway and Cormac McCarthy, and I love contemporary literary fiction for adults, but I also love this kind of literature that I fell in love with when I was a kid. I love children's literature. I love middle grade literature. I love horror. I'm reading a bunch of Stephen King at the moment, and I think he's fantastic. And so the academic world sometimes gives the impression that there's a right kind of story that you should tell. And so for a long time, I thought, okay, if I want to be a serious writer, I need to write this serious literary fiction for adults. And I had to get over kind of this bias that was trained into me when I was a college student and a graduate student, that there was this kind of one true story that you were supposed to tell. And what helped me do that was just being around kids and recognizing that, you know, I fell in love with literature for a certain reason when I was a kid, because of what stories could do for me, how they could creep me out, create those prickles on the back of my neck, and, you know, make goose flesh rise on my arms. And spending time with kids, my children and their friends, really kind of reawakened me to the kind of stories that I wanted to tell and the kind of writer that I wanted to be. So that's when I returned to children's literature and really dove in deep with that.
Yeah. If that's not a good reason to pursue your passion right there, then I don't know what would be. Because I think there's a lot to be, excuse me, a lot to be said for the children's book genre, in any genre actually. Each one comes with its own challenges in writing and marketing, and I appreciate that you decided to choose to follow your passion and write books for kids. And I enjoy the stories myself, so maybe not just for kids.
Yeah. Well, for me, one difference, you know, writing for adults feels to me a little bit like preaching to the choir, right? Because by the time someone's 40 years old, they've sort of developed their reading habits, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they love to read, they know that already, and they're regular readers. And I think it can be a real challenge to get people who are, you know, 40 years old, 45 years old to become readers if they haven't already done that. Not that it doesn't happen, of course it does, but I think it's kind of harder, as those people are often set in their ways. But I feel like kids, especially in like 5th and 6th grade, are really at this crossroads in their relationship with reading. And I feel like it's so important at that age to let kids know that whatever they like to read, there's a book out there for them. And if we can kind of get kids hooked on reading when they're, you know, 10, 11, 12 years old, they're likely to become lifelong readers. And so I'm in the business. So I see myself as a children's author as like, I'm a proselyte for literature, right? I'm on the side of reading and books, and I'm on Team Kid. And so I'm trying to get kids who are on the fence about reading to be less on the fence about reading. I'm trying to get them to fall in love with literature in the way that I did when I was a kid, fall in love with stories in the way that I did when I was a kid, so that they can have kind of richer, fuller, more literature-filled lives.
Mm-hmm. And shouldn't that be the goal of every author, is to just write the book that somebody's going to want to read one day, that's going to inspire them to keep up their literacy and pursue that. And I think there's a lot of outside health benefits to just being a long time life reader, but we won't get into that right now. But it is worth pursuing. So with that, you I mean, it shouldn't be ever too late to try, but I feel like there is this stigma around us that if we don't get it published like right away, I mean, I feel the pressure, and I'm still in my 20s, mid 20s. Then obviously you don't have anything good to write anymore because nobody's accepting it, right? So you just give up then. What would you have to say to those kind of people that are wondering if what they have is worth pursuing past their early career, and how is that for you?
Yeah, so I published my first book when I was 45 years old. I'm 48 now, and published my first book at 45, which I got to tell you, that was not the plan. Right? That was not the map that I had for my life when I was 20 years old. I finished graduate school. I earned my master's in creative writing in 2001. I was 27 years old. And I thought, okay, I'm 27. I just finished formal schooling, and I'm gonna publish that first book by the time I'm 30. And I kind of floundered around and couldn't find, and was trying to write contemporary literary fiction for adults, and that was sort of working for me, but not really. And I turned 30 and I still didn't have a book out there. I still hadn't published a book, and I felt kind of bad. And I thought, okay, I'm going to give myself till I'm 35. And then I worked and kind of floundered around some more and experienced a lot of rejection and failure. And I became 35 and then 40. And I got really discouraged. When I turned 40 and I still hadn't published a book, that was really hard. I got really discouraged, and I'd often say things to myself like, okay, this is never going to happen for me. Am I just wasting my time? Right? Why am I even trying anymore? And so there were a lot of kind of dark days where I thought those sorts of things. And then I read something by a writer named Julia Cameron, who she addresses this very thing in some of her work, this idea that your ship has sailed. And she said, one concern that a lot of writers have is, well, how old am I going to be by the time I publish my first book? And her answer to that is, well, the same age you're going to be if you don't publish your first book. And I realized I'm going to turn 45 one way or another, right? I mean, unless something terrible happens, I'm going to turn 45, right?
I hope so.
So I can either turn 45 with a published book, or I can turn 45 without it. But either way, I'm going to turn 45. And so I'm going to age regardless. And so I might as well keep trying to do this. I might as well keep pursuing my dream, keep sort of chasing this goal. And I saw a Twitter thread recently where somebody posted, hey, debut writers or writers, how old were you when your first book debuted? And this is obviously not a scientific study, but I was scrolling through the comments on Twitter, and so many of the writers who were responding to this thread were in their 40s when their first book came out. 45, 47, 48, a lot of people 50s, 60s. And that seemed to be the rule, not the exception. And I know so many writers who are getting their kind of big break in their 40s. And one reason for that, I think it can just take a couple of decades to hone your skills, right? This is a skill which takes time and effort to develop. And you just have to amass, your 10,000 hours of writing. You have to amass your 10,000 pages of practice before you get good at this. And so I think for a lot of people, the way they live their lives, if they want families and careers outside of writing, or if they want to put food on the table and those kinds of things, it can just take a long time. We need to be gentle with ourselves. We need to be patient with ourselves and just allow ourselves to continue building our creative lives, not so worried about that ticking clock behind us as the years and the days pass. So I'd say, to a writer who's saying, okay, I'm getting old and I haven't gotten my big break yet. What's going on? I'm almost 30, I'm almost 40, I'm almost 50, whatever. I would just say, be gentle with yourself and just keep chasing your dream. If this is something you're committed to, keep chasing it and be gentle with yourself. Don't beat yourself up over getting old. We all get old if we're lucky.
That's great. And that's something that you had in your bio, is just being an advocate for being gentle on yourself. That's such a good phrase. Be gentle with yourself. There's so much criticism in this area, and I think I don't need to add my own criticism, at least the long-term kind that hurts pretty bad.
Right. And it helps me to remember that what I'm trying to build, more than I'm trying to build a writing career, I'm trying to build a creative life. I'm trying to build a life in which creativity plays a central role. And publication may come and publication may not come, but I can control, I can't control how I can't control how frequently I publish. I can't control how many copies my book sells. There's so many things that are out of my hand, out of my hands. But the one thing I can control is the extent to which creativity is central to my life. And so I'm trying to make that my focus. I'm trying to live a life in which creativity and literature plays a central role, because that's really what I'm building, more than I'm building a writing career, more than I'm building a list of publications. I'm building a creative life.
So good. That's perfect. That's exactly the kind of answer that I would hope people would take to heart. And I'm definitely gonna try to recenter my focus on keeping creativity at the center, because let's be honest, if publication is your goal with this as your career, then you're probably in the wrong career.
Yeah,
If you're not
if
doing it
your
because you
goal,
love it,
yeah, if your goal is to get rich and famous, I can think of like 100 easier ways to get rich and famous. You should do one of those instead.
yeah, that's with less heartache,
Yeah, right,
for
right.
sure. Yeah. So, just tell me about let's just switch a little and talk about what you love about the children's book market. I mean, what is great about being a children's book author? What have you noticed? Have you interacted with kids before? What impact has that had on your life?
Okay, so that's my favorite thing about becoming a published children's author is the opportunity to talk to kids about my stories and creativity and imagination. And because I write horror, I talk to kids a lot about bravery. So I've probably visited, since I've become a published author 3 years ago, I've probably visited, I'm going to say like 100 different schools to do school assemblies and presentations. And this I just love. This is one of the richest facets of my life, that I get to go into schools and classrooms and auditoriums, and I get to talk to kids about the things that make us afraid, and I get to talk about why it's important to be brave, and I get to talk about the power of imagination to help us be brave and to heal us. And this is something I'm really passionate about. One reason I write children's horror, that genre specifically, is because I think that today kids live in a really big, scary world. Right? It's a terrifying time to be a children. A lot of the adults in kids' lives they're angry. They're yelling at the television, at the president, at each other, at the opposite political party, at whatever, right? It's a terrifying time to witness all of this as a kid. And through the pandemic, children are smart. They know that more than a million Americans have died of COVID, and many kids know people who've died of COVID.
Mm,
Grandparents, aunts, uncles, some of them, sadly, immediate family members, their mother, their father. It's a
mm,
terrifying time to be a child. And one reason I write children's horror is because literature gives us a chance to examine what is broken, and to take our suffering and find meaning in it, and sort of try and bring it to some kind of wholeness. And when we read a spooky book, even if it's a playful spooky book, a story about a haunted street sign or something, kids get to experience fear and anxiety and tension in a safe space, right? Their bedroom or their classroom or the library, and they get to practice these emotions. You read a spooky book and you feel a little anxiety, you feel a little bit of fear, and your brain starts working on those emotions, trying to figure out, how do I navigate this thing called fear? How do I deal with my anxiety? How do I succeed in a world that can be absolutely terrifying? And as your brain starts working on that, you read another spooky book and your brain works on it some more. And you read another scary book and your brain works on it some more. And what you're really doing is you're practicing bravery. I tell kids that spooky stories, this is bravery practice. And if you want to be brave in this world, one great way to practice being brave is to read spooky books. So that when really scary things happen in your real life, your brain's been through this again and again and again, and is equipped to deal with these emotions. And this is going to sound a little cheesy, but this is the gift I'm trying to give kids as an author. I'm trying to give them the gift of bravery. I'm trying to help kids recognize that you can navigate your anxieties and your fears in healthy, strong, kind of the magnificent ways. You can be brave. There's a writer, G.K. Chesterton. I'm probably going to butcher this quote, but he said this years ago: fairy tales do not teach children that monsters are real. Children already know that monsters are real. Fairy tales teach children that monsters can be defeated. And this is why I write horror, is because children, they already know that monsters are real. Well, horror teaches kids that monsters can be defeated.
Mm. Wow. That is, I don't even have words to conclude that. That's perfect. That's exactly. I mean, Josh is he's talked to so many kids I know from personal stories, and I've heard some really touching things about just their responses and how resilient they can be, and how they're so much smarter than people give them credit for. Kids are,
Right.
and
As an author, sometimes people are like, "You write children's horror? What's the matter with you?" Um, but my thing is, I want to respect kids enough to scare the living daylights out of them. I want to respect their grace and their bravery, their ability to have hope, their ability to heal. I want to respect their goodness and their strength enough to not condescend to them. Um, so I don't think we should condescend to children. We should respect them enough to tell them the truth about the world we live in, and we should respect them enough to give them the heebie-jeebies, because they're tough. They can take it. Children are not delicate teacups. They can handle it.
hmm. So you're telling me that literature can help me solve my anxiety so that later when I'm querying, I can handle my fears less scared. Wow.
That is
Who would have
exactly what I'm
thought?
telling you. Yes. In fact,
Who would
there's
have
okay.
thought?
So while I'm on this subject, there's a really interesting study from researchers from the University of Chicago and Penn State University. They wanted to see if there was a correlation between the kinds of fictions that people consume and their emotional resilience through the pandemic. And this study,
Wow.
it's called Pandemic Practice: Horror Fans and Morbidly Curious Individuals Are More Psychologically Resilient During the COVID-19 Pandemic. What these researchers discovered is that people who consumed a bunch of frightening fiction, basically people who read a bunch of horror, when the pandemic happened, they demonstrated greater emotional resilience through the pandemic than people who had not read a bunch of horror, which I think is fascinating, right? Because, and in a
That
way,
is fascinating.
it makes a weird, perfect kind of sense. Because if you've been reading The Walking Dead and then the pandemic hits, you're like, I've been through this again and again and again in story, and you're ready to kind of navigate it, right? So these the things that we read, the emotions that we practice in fiction, in literature, the lessons that we learn are translatable to our own lives, which I think is super cool, right? I mean, this really taps into the power of literature and speaks to just how important it is to give children books that will make them resilient, that will make them brave.
I wish maybe that I had looked into that more when I was younger. I do remember reading some children's horror, and I have a distinct time that I remember. One of my earliest memories is sitting in, I think, first grade, second grade, reading a Goosebumps and having someone from reading time dropped their book on the floor, and I shot like 6 feet into the air because I was so into the book and so invested in the story that I had forgotten that I was in the classroom. And I just remember sitting back and being like, wow, like books are so powerful. I just, my emotions were so invested in that, even as a kid. And so I think this is just so important for people to understand. It really is. As we're wrapping up, I'm going to ask my usual question for this show, which is there seems to be a sort of a secret sauce for published authors and successful writers, and I think that that can be debunked. I think that there's individual qualities that make someone successful, but from your experience grading a million papers, reading a lot of literature from peers, and then writing some your own, is there any kind of quality or tendency that successful writers have had that you have seen in them that has led them to a better career?
Um, I don't think it's a secret. what I'm about to say, in fact, it feels it feels pretty mundane what I'm about to say, but I think it is the formula. And I think it's this: the most successful writers I've known are people who write every day and read every day. They just make it a daily habit. Sometimes students in my creative writing classes, they kind of bristle when I tell them they need to write every day. They're like, no, but I just want to write when the muse speaks to me, right? I want to write when inspiration strikes. And if you wait to write until inspiration strikes, I mean, you're going to be waiting a really long time, right? Some days inspiration comes and some days it doesn't. Or, some days inspiration strikes, you sit down, you write a couple sentences, and then it all starts to fall apart. A writer is somebody who, like, so this little mantra that I have for myself to kind of motivate myself: butt in the chair, words on the page. That's how this gets done. You got to put your butt in the chair and you got to put words on the page, and you got to do it every single day, even if you don't feel like it. Even if it's hard, even if you're convinced what you're writing that day is absolutely terrible and awful and you're just not feeling it, you got to do it every single day. And I found that more often than not, when you sit down to write, even if you think, oh, I'm just not feeling it today, it's no good, once you sit down and start going, you'll kind of find your flow. You kind of get into it. And some of the best writing days I've had are the days where I didn't even want to do it at all, but I sat down out of habit, right? Out of commitment and out of habit. So the secret sauce, I think, is write every day and read every day. Immerse yourself in a world of story and words and make it a daily habit.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, maybe
in the chair, we're on the page.
Right. Maybe a related point on that is I hear a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to write a book when. They say, when I graduate from college, when I retire, when my kids are out of the house, when this happens. If you can't fold writing, you have to find a way to make writing a part of the life you're currently living. Because that golden future you're imagining where you have hours and hours to write, it may never materialize, right? It may never come to be. And so if writing is important to you, you have to find ways to make it a part of your daily life right now. You can't wait for that golden future when suddenly you have time, because you're never going to have more time than you have right now. Life is busy and it's going to stay busy. You got to find a way to carve out writing time in your life today, right now, not waiting for some golden future.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of other careers you can time optimize differently if that's what you're going for, but just even in my own experience, that consistency teaches you something about yourself. You learn more endurance, you learn to maintain your creative vibe, and also just getting into that zone, being able to remain in that zone, I think is really important. So thank you. Thank you for that comment. As we're wrapping up here, Josh, is there any parting words of advice that you would have to our listeners, which are primarily those working on their manuscripts, working on their pieces, but haven't gotten to their arrived at the success that they're seeking?
Maybe my parting thought, and this is more a reminder to myself than it is advice to others, but maybe others can find some goodness in it, I hope. I often have to remind myself this ultimately should be about joy, right? If my writing's not bringing me joy, it's not going to bring anyone else joy. And so do it for the joy, right? Do it because you love story, do it because you can't not. Do it because you want stories to exist in the world that will bring you joy and that will bring others joy.
Yeah. Right,
I'm on the side of joy. I am pro joy.
We should all be on pro joy.
It's team joy. We should all be on it.
Need a t-shirt, need a plaque up there. Team joy. That's awesome. Well, how can we get connected with your community? This show is about building the writers community. What can we do to connect with you?
Oh, you can follow me on Twitter. I am at Just Josh Allen on Twitter. And I'm not super active on Twitter, but I get on a couple times a week and sort of see what's going on in the Kidlit community. That's a great way to get involved. If you're in the Utah-Idaho area, you can join SCBWI, the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I'm pretty active in the local chapter of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, SCBWI, a great organization. A great way to form connections with other people who want to write the kind of things that you want to write.
Great. That's awesome. Check him out. Watch him on Twitter, just Josh Allen. And just thank you for coming on the show. I knew it was going to be a great first episode for our guests, and I'm really excited for them to get all the information out of it that I did, the useful resources. So thanks for coming on to the show, Josh.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners, you wordsmiths out there, keep writing on.